Well, hello, everybody. This is Paul J. Leslie. Today, I have something really special to share, and that's an interview with my friend, James Tunney. He is an Irishman living in Sweden. James is a qualified barrister who has lectured all over the world, specializing in international law. He's also slaved away in the world of academia. And these days, he's spending his time doing a lot of writing and researching. He's an artist, a poet, and an author. His latest book is called Empire of Scientism. And I'm going to put his website, jamestunney.com, in the links below. So, James, thanks so much, my friend, for talking to me today in this format.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm very interested in your work, and I've learned from your work, and I'm looking forward to learning more from our conversation. And so I'm really looking forward. So thanks for the opportunity.
Sure. Well, I think the topic that we kind of want to focus on, as we were talking previously, is this idea of dispiriting our world, and how our world seems to lately have gone in a direction that may be more of a root of a lot of our problems, particularly in my field, mental health problems, than we sometimes think, even though there's a balance of good and bad with everything, that we're in a real transition period with technology and those kind of things. So I wonder if you could just to start out with, this, a lot of your work that I've read, there's a kind of central theme of dispiriting culture. Can you kind of tell me how you came to that, and kind of how that's made an impact on your life?
Okay. Well, I suppose the roots of this idea are deep for me. And I saw the end of a very rural, if you want to call it primitive or peasant society in Ireland. I'm not saying that in a derogatory sense, but it was the end of an era where if you were out on a farm, if I remember where my grandfather was, it was almost medieval with a handheld plow. And it's kind of difficult for people to understand, or young people. Right. So it was the same as I've seen in medieval tapestries, a person with a plow, the same scenario. So people lived very close to the earth, and their environment, the world was different. And we read all the time that their world was very impoverished. And this is a materialist description, that everything was bad, was terrible. But in many senses, in mental health sense, although there was structural problems, for example, in Ireland caused by colonization, and that it takes a post-colonial situation a long time to rectify that. In relation to the world view of people, it was a lot more enchanted. It was a lot more open to perceiving things in different ways. And of course, so they had a deep religiosity or spirituality. Now, sometimes they say about Irish people that they had a very thin veneer of Christianity over a very deep pagan sense. Mm-hmm. And that's true in some sense. For example, I remember my grandmother, she was very interested in the Holy Spirit. It wasn't in any pious way, you wouldn't know it. Mm-hmm. But if you talked around the way, you'd find that they saw the world in spiritual terms. And if we look at what has happened or how the world has changed, take Ireland, for example, they have been very influenced by these views, Dawkins, that kind of scientism, that kind of fundamentalist view, which says that, which we have to define as scientism. We're not talking about science itself, of course. We're talking about the idea that science claims more than it can deliver, that it extends beyond its natural boundaries, that it makes claims that it can't deliver on, and it rejects anything that is beyond its methodology and comprehension. And if we go back to, I think I probably share this with you. I'm pragmatic and I'm cosmopolitan in my approach as a methodology. So I'm willing to look at what works, and wherever it comes from, I'd integrate. And I can see that in your work. I think I share that with you. So it doesn't matter if it's left or right, for example, their analysis might be correct. For example, although I would reject communist solutions or whatever, it doesn't mean that some of the left-wing critiques of the capitalist system aren't correct, for example. and we can see this in Adorno and Horkheimer, that their view of the disenchanting effect of the Enlightenment was quite a good summary. For other sources, of course, C.S. Lewis was aware of the danger of scientocracy and the idea that he expressed in The Abolition of Man and in that hideous strength, the idea that scientism would become a fundamental ideology, and that part of that was related to dispiriting. So dispiriting is an effect of this Enlightenment, post-Reformation, Enlightenment, scientific revolution idea that science, mechanism, machines determine everything, and even deeper ideas. The idea of 1747, man as machine, that we are machines. In fact, that we're clockwork ideas. So that's a very, it's a very dehumanizing idea. So that persists today, and it's become deeper. It's recently, I predicted a while ago that there was, well, whoever was listening, not many, that we would have this process of dispiriting. The implications of the Enlightenment is not just that they were going to displace religious authority, but a lot of the people involved see it as a zero-sum game. So not only do they have to dispose of religion, but spirituality has to go as well. So the toleration of even the idea of the spirit is disappearing. The idea that we are spiritual beings is going to be, there is a war against the spirit in many senses. And associated with that is associated ideas of loss of meaning, loss of hope, all the things that were embedded in spiritual traditions, whatever they are, whatever they came from. And those things are taken away. So there's a secondary effect. So there is a process, and then there is an impact on people, that we have this existential anomie, or this angst or anxiety, who am I, or nothing. And at the same time, we have this process of technology which says, well, you're a machine, and the great thing in the future, we're going to make you into a machine with transhumanism. It's quite incredible. Now, I never would have believed that people would have been open to the idea. But if you see another book, I had to get it from the library again, a different version, to see was he actually, did he say the things that I quote him on? The World, the Flesh and the Devil by Bernal in 1929, where he describes where us, the docile population in the future, would live in a human zoo, where he describes the need to transfer from biology to machines, where he describes the need for a breakaway civilization. Now, this is an Irish X-ray crystallographer, an important scientist. He lays it out there. He was influential for Arthur C. Clarke, and that's where C.S. Lewis began. He was around some of these people, and he realized that they were serious. This was not some science fiction fantasy. They were going to impose this, and they were going to impose this as an ideology, and hence my empire of scientism. And that leads to a question: is there's also a connection with your field, with psychotherapy. If you look at in the 1860s in Britain, there was a rise in a defense of the spirit, and you had a history of the supernatural, 1863, and then you had a reaction by Thomas Huxley and those who began, Thomas H. Huxley, who began to utilize principles associated with evolution to say, well, only science is the only explanation. And he said in relation to spiritualist phenomena that even if they were proved, he wouldn't accept them. So there was a bias there consistent with scientism. And that process is continuing. So I would challenge psychotherapists. Now you're a bit different. I'm not challenging you directly because you're more open than most people in your field to in your explorations of the idea of magic and Milton Erickson. You're a bit more open, but I challenge most people to say, well, if you are living in a system which is becoming diseased in some sense, it's no good making people adapt to that diseased scenario. And in fact, if the tools and the lessons learned from cybernetics and all these things are actually used by people, they're using their wisdom against and in order to manipulate people, well, then it's a poacher gamekeeper scenario. We have to people have to think about what they're doing, how they're contributing towards the system. So dispiriting in two senses, a general sense and a particular sense.
Yeah. You know, when you were saying about the idea of science, that has been recently, in particular, a bit of a problem for me and some other of my colleagues who are very, I mean, they're scientists, but they see this idea of science being thrown around as if it is a noun instead of a verb. And one of my colleagues says when he sees people with these shirts or signs that says, "I believe in science," he says it's to him the equivalent of saying, "I believe in a hammer." I mean, it's just something you use. And I think, unfortunately, the beauty of science, and it is an amazing thing, has been co-opted by, I'm overgeneralizing, but has been co-opted by some as a way to, you know, assert either opinions about certain things depending on how studies are formed, or to maneuver politically or media and all these kind of things. And to me, that's where we get into this unfortunate idea that science is infallible, because as we know, Karl Popper said, you can never really prove anything, you can only falsify. But yet it seems almost like it preys on people who don't understand the basics of science, that a scientist who oh gosh, who said this? Someone said this, and I'll remember their name in a minute, said basically they're now the high priests of our Western culture. Is that if a scientist says it, then people say, well, you know, trust the science, trust the scientist. And I think in some ways that's good, but the flip side of that, again, there's that balance, is that we're not giving enough insight into anything a scientist observes is a flawed system, a nervous system. And, you know, it's how are these studies set up? And you know, there's nothing that is absolute. And I want to mention too, just your comment about watching your grandfather. It's like, I was actually saying this last night to someone, it's like the old farmers, they had the same basic human problems that we have today, but I've often wondered that being so in touch with nature and seeing the cycles of life come and go gives a sense of connection that, unfortunately, I think with this rising and rapid technical world we live in, that helps create that dispiriting feeling. And that now we're in a system that now is being held together by the very things that may be dispiriting it. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there was a lot of things came up as you said that. I was thinking, if you think about it from the spiritual perspective, Jung mentioned a number of times about how few Catholics he coming to see him. That was interesting. The implication was that there was something in the practice that dealt with some of the issues that he was getting elsewhere. So the point being that it's not just about Catholicism, but it's about a number of different systems that people had access to, whereby it's not about, the whole issue is not about them. It's not about the ego. So there was other systems to look to where you were smaller in. And the same thing about nature. As I said, I'm not saying that the people in the country were necessarily, they were very devout in some senses, but the church, when it came to Ireland, had to marry itself with the pre-existing pagan culture. Mm-hmm. So Saint Bridget, for example, and wells and the importance of wells and water and all this indigenous culture was there up to very, very recently. And even the protection of the fairy forts. Now, these were the remains of the pre-existing people that had lived there, that were often associated with fairies, where people would see fairies. So people would never touch them. They would never build over them. So they weren't preserved by law or by cultural protection. They were preserved by people's sense of place. And that's why they persisted. And they probably will be destroyed more and more in the future, because when you begin to deconstruct this meaning, you take away other things that, and this is a problem with a kind of Western view in general, the Faustian idea, the idea that they forget about the assumptions on which the culture is based. Mm-hmm. And that we can see in, for example, of Ayn Rand, when she suggests this great hero that does everything on their own. They forget that in order, for example, to patent a product, if you do come up with a great invention, you're able to recoup your profits because of the patent system which is there. That's given to you by the sovereignty of the people. So you're getting a benefit from the people. You're getting support from all the wisdom that's there beforehand. So this idea of an individual who has done everything, this kind of Faustian idea, a Promethean idea, the idea which is the basis of certain types of black magic, that you come up and you achieve mastery over people as opposed to a more, say, spiritual or mystical approach, is dangerous. And you mentioned about a hammer, and it was a good point. And I think, well, we know the old saying that if you have a hammer and you see everything in terms of a hammer, that you're going to go looking for nails, and that's the dangerous thing. And there's also a bigger problem in the sense that in the empire of scientism idea, that the colony is us, we're the colony. So the guys, some of your colleagues are assisting, you're the anthropologist going out into the jungle to prepare the empire, to feed back to the empire about how you go in and manipulate people. And I can see this. There's an area called normalization process theory, I see, where they're utilizing cognitive and behavioral patterns in order to be able to project systems, new systems onto people. So you get groups or companies or people to accept new things. So this can be very manipulative, kind of like a marketing embedded behavioralist. And you mentioned about cybernetics. You've talked about cybernetics, and that's very, very important. But it's interesting in cybernetics that both Bateson, Gregory Bateson, and also Norman Wiener, whatever you want to pronounce it, as a father of cybernetics, he understood this, and he wrote about, in God and Golem Inc., he wrote about the dangers of gadget worshippers, and he explained it very well. And he identified that fear, that the kind of the approach of the magician. Now, not in the sense that you use magic, but in the sense of the person who wants to dominate things, the magic scientific sense, the sense of having control over people, which is always the negative side of magic, as is a positive and negative side. And he identified that. So he was in, and he understood the dangers associated with that. And also, of course, if we Feyerabend and his looking at epistemology and saying, well, there is no such thing as science, consistent with what you said. There's different scientists. And even when you look at method, and again, Bateson talked about that induction and deduction wasn't enough as a description, and abduction and all that kind of stuff. But even when you read about induction and deduction, and you realize in the real world situation, knowledge isn't accumulated in that way. It's a lot more complex. There's an interaction, there's a circularity about it.
Right.
And then you have to consider, as an epistemological fact, the mystical approach. If you go back to Surawardi, for example, the 12th century mystic, the Persian mystic, Sufi mystic, he laid out the idea that, as well as the epistemology from empiricism and study experience in the world, there's also the revelatory epistemology, the knowledge that comes from a higher source in the process of illumination. And this is the core of mysticism. And this is the thing that scientism can't accept, and even science finds it difficult. Although I will say that I think it's called a professional affiliate of the Galileo Commission, which is a group of scientists who are interested in post-materialist science. There's two networks which are closely related: the scientific and medical network, and the Galileo Commission. The Galileo Commission has some very interesting people. So these are people that are very respected in their fields. That have often been interested in parapsychology, but also in quantum physics and the whole lot. So they're very disciplined, and they realize that the current materialist paradigm in science is too limited, and they are open to a lot more. So there is interesting things going on in that domain. And one of the reasons why I do maintain contact is because I've been very critical of science, but it's important for me to understand what some scientists are saying, and the good guys out there. But I mean, it is very, very frightening. And there's another issue which is not associated with science, but it's associated with the bureaucratic mindset, which was in the books, like I think the culture of narcissism, and the way there's this certain personality that are very successful functionaries, and they may know nothing about science. I agree with you about science, and most good scientists reject bad science, because a lot of what scientism is bad science and pseudoscience. Although unfortunately, good scientists can also be too quiet when we need them. For example, when we're governed by statistical models, for example, and where those are not based on robust assumptions, where we can see that there's flaws in the model. Well, that's when you want the scientists who know what they're talking about to come and to be critical. But there is a sense from outside the domain, for me, that a lot of people are afraid about where their source of income is coming from. A lot of people work in the military, industrial, security, pharmaceutical context. And if they do, I won't say about selling your soul to the devil, but I mean, you have to bear in mind that unfortunately, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we know, for example, about the extent of control of the media by pharmaceutical companies. And we know from Chomsky about the propaganda model, and Bernays about how corporate entities control information, and whoever is controlling the corporate, etc. So it's not a surprise then that we do have these other values which obscure the central heart of the scientific endeavor. But still, even with the best scientists, in my view, have humility, and they're not going to project a definitive view. And I think it's good to be able to hold competing. You might have an answer to something, but hold competing constructs in your mind. You don't have to have one all the time. Sorry, it cut me off if I'm going on too long.
No, it's all great. Because you said something about cybernetics and Bates, and that jogged in my mind how toward the end of his career, particularly, he was saying this in general in ecological systems, and then specifically toward my field of therapy, is that the idea of power, setting a context of power within the cybernetic feedback loops and everything like that is the royal road to destruction. And to me, it's kind of telling how much, and this may be a human quality, because we all want to feel like we are in control. We talked a little bit about the existential angst and things, but this desire to control so much that we're actually creating these feedback loops that end up cutting our own throats, but yet we don't realize it. It's like we keep doing the same thing over and over, and we're not aware that the result we're getting is due to what we're doing. And I think when you take a linear model, sometimes you miss that, instead of, like you say, the circularity. So with that being said, how do you think we kind of come out of some of this dispiriting? If somebody's listening to us and go, okay, these guys both, I get it, they both like science, but they say science has its limits, and so what do I do? I mean, on an individual level, I mean, what are your thoughts about what one does?
There's two issues, and if I was to define, I was very happy at home, being a stay-at-home father, painting, looking after the kids. I was totally happy. I had no desire to go out into the public again. I had no desire I'd worked in the universities, and yourself, when you're teaching, in front of people, it's tiring over a period of time. Then you have all the administrative apparatus, you know what I'm talking about. So it's very, very tiring, and it's, it's very. I had a great time, and then you have to publish and all that kind of. You work very, very hard. So I had a great time at that, but it doesn't leave a space for a lot of things. So I was very happy when I said, okay, I'm leaving that behind. I'm going to paint, I'm going to write, look after the family, and develop, explore, whatever. So I really burned my boats so that I could do that. I had very good connections, but I said, I have to leave this behind. I don't want to be doing consultancies and someone ringing me up, well, I'm doing a nice consultancy in the Caribbean. Would you like to, it's, and I said, no, I'm concentrating on these issues. So in some sense, I went back into a cave, an oceanal cave, in the sense of away from all those other forces. And I created a bit of space for myself. And I came to so I have come to I won't say my mission, it sounds but the idea for me is that the positive role is to focus on the idea of spiritual evolution. Everybody needs, in my view, to evolve. Now, the word spirit might be difficult for people to accept. We want to use it in terms of psychological development, but I would actually say spiritual development, because I'll come back to that in a second why. So I think there has to be individual spiritual evolution, and that has to happen on a broader level. And that all the problems that we have in the world, whether it be war or the military-industrial complex, or the fact that we're facing a technocracy, a scientocracy that will utilize principles of cybernetics, which of course means governance. It's all about governance. A lot of these people that were paid by the military-industrial complex, and then they realized, well, hold on, this is not going down. We see the same thing with John Lilly, for example, in relation to he's working, and then he says this is not good. So that they're signaling to us that there's something amiss in the system, and that's why people like Bates and he was involved in some of the cybernetic conferences, or the people involved in the Ratio Club and after the Second World War in Britain, because the origin of this, of course, of those structures is that after the First World War and Second World War, they realized they could run the economy in a different way, and they were therefore willing to set up a new apparatus which would dispose of all those difficult ideas like capitalism, free market, and all that. So that's really the deeper thing. So the dark side that has to be opposed, if you like, and I think that's the correct idea, is of an ideology of scientism, which comes to an empire of scientism. The danger that we're going to be run by a scientocracy utilizing the tools of technology through the convergence of networks facilitated by digitalization that unites the worst of capitalism and communism together in an apparatus of control where they can operate together, because they are both materialist ideologies. They are both at base in many ways, but particularly communism is clearly a materialist ideology, and it was often described as scientific socialism. And in crony capitalism, we have also where we have this technocrat. So if you look at the type of people that have risen to the top, and Hayek talked about this, why the worst rise to the top. If we look at the people that have become very, very successful, they're a very, very particular mindset. The reasons why they have become powerful in the domain of technology is because they have a very, very particular mindset, which makes them see the world in a particular way. And often, as far as I can see from the studies, they don't have a spiritual dimension to them. They see those things as difficult to grasp. They see the world in a very literalistic way. And that literalism is the same literalism that we see as a problem, from my perspective, in religiosity, when it becomes over literal, when it begins to take things and doesn't see the spirit of them. Mm-hmm. So for me, if you look at the mystical journey, what I tried to do was to explain that there is a pattern to all mystics' lives, or the spiritual evolution, whereby they go through a process of examination of the ego, or an effort to transcend the ego by looking outside themselves. They begin to identify that there is a kind of a construct of themselves, what I call a false self, and then they begin to realize that there's something behind that. You like to call it the spirit or the true self. There is the seer, the person who looks at this construct, the person who is behind it all, who doesn't have a name, if you like, who is there before where we become Paul or James or whatever. It's broader than that. It's consciousness itself. And that consciousness, or the true self, if you look at Evelyn Underhill, she talked about spiritual consciousness. Now, we have to bear in mind that if we say, okay, well, I don't care about this spirit thing, I don't care about consciousness, that certain scientists and psychologists and neuroscientists are saying, you don't have consciousness, you don't have free will, you don't have personhood, you don't have identity. So when you take away all those, the recipe for your enslavement is made, because it's going to be very, very difficult for you to identify that you have any human dignity. And we're going through the consequence of this, we will have to reap. It hasn't come yet. We have just been, for the last couple of years, in a very bad restaurant with a very bad waiter who has been abusing us. Now we have to go and get the bill with a big 7-foot bouncer called Igor, who's going to give us the bill. We haven't got the bill for all this process yet. And this is coming. And people, I hear some spiritual people saying, oh, it's a great opportunity to look at your life and all this. No, we have to look at the things that's outside us. Now, my view is the same as your view, that individuals are very, very powerful, that what they have to do is to access the resources within them. I would call them spiritual resources, without putting that into any category. Spiritual consciousness. Look at what the models, the people who have accessed their spiritual consciousness come from. Look at Maslow's, the people who are self-actualized people often have mystical experiences. That is what helps them at the top. The people who have been successful in a real world context often have done that exploration.
Right.
So I believe, as you do, that every individual is very, very powerful, but they are subject to an environment that tells them all the time that they are weak, that they are nothing, that they are. When I was over in Carolina and I was looking at the television years ago, I was surprised with all the ads that came on. And in nearly all the ads, there was a context, and then the person had a problem. They had a problem, I don't know, they smelled bad or something, and you see the person being alienated, and then if you buy this product, you will be okay. That was all the ads, the paradigm is all. And even that process is, I mean, that doesn't make you feel good. People weren't subjected to this kind of abuse years ago. So buy this, you're bad, there's something wrong with you, we're going to solve, you know. So all this, I ditched that out in relation to the starting point. And you must do so in relation to your idea of your clients, because as far as I'm guessing now from what I can see from what you've said, that if you're looking, the thing about Milton Erickson is, the thing that I was drawn to him, he had some of that kind of farmer's wisdom. It was very, very practical, homespun, down to earth, applied, pragmatic. And he had this perception, and he applied it in the context, but his application was individual, because he was dealing with the person that came to him as an individual, not as a machine, not as some identikit person, but a person that had a very specific mindset and also had the resources within them to be able to solve that. So what he was doing, as far as I can see, was helping the person access their own resources. Now, I assume that what you're doing, as far as I can gather from your magical thinking and your exploration of magical thinking, and I found it fascinating, as far as I remember, when you were describing that you understood for yourself that you needed more magic, and from that you began to access your deeper resources. And from that model, you're going into the deeper domain where you're opening up, and therefore you can draw on a range of cosmopolitan sources to help the other person find their own inner power. So there's no guru context, there's no one giving anything. The person, you're holding a mirror up to them, and sometimes the other dimension that I see in Erickson, which I gather that you have as well, is this playful element. The idea that, like in Jap Tangsep, whatever his name is, Pangsep, the idea of the play idea in the brain, the play circuit, and the idea of how important that is. And sometimes when you're doing something different, it's the same in art, you're utilizing that idea, because a person can go into different networks, they can access them, and they can find creativity. So my message is a supreme message of hope from what the mystics have said, from what spiritual people have said about our own resources. Now, we don't have to say that that's a divinely, that's a different argument. But the fact that it's there, that it produces results, that there's a pattern of people producing results, accessing knowledge, epistemology, that's where the solutions come to. And often it's at times of crisis that people can access those deeper things. And often it's because of the difficulties people challenge. It's when a person feels that their construct is broken down. It's when that point that you mentioned, that's where the humility is. That's where that's the holy grail. There's nothing in the construct. You're receptive, you're open, and it's at that point, as in the meek shall inherit the earth sense, it's at that point when you're open that you're open to the broader sense of yourself, because your expectations haven't worked, your construct hasn't served you well. Right. And sometimes another person can destabilize that, they can prod you, they can open, they can change you. Another word that I would think of is habit. And the main idea of how habit would have been used in Ireland was when a person is dead, they get their habit. And it's it's the same word, you know, the corpse has a habit. And it's a very appropriate, because habits can be deadly. Yeah. You know, and the only time you want to be in certain habits is when you're dead, you know, but a habit is the same word as how you're dressed. It's the same root as rehabilitation and to dress oneself. And so when you do your idea of magical sessions, in the sense of whether you or the client not literally puts on a magician's costume, but you're breaking out of the habit of what's there, and that's what a lot of, I imagine what a lot of I don't, we used to, because we have I had a lot of pubs in Ireland and Scotland. People often went there for their psychotherapy. You go down the pub and you have a drink, and the person you communicate with the person, they don't really listen, and then it's off your chest. So in America, you have the psychotherapist, but in a sense, that kind of dialogue and interaction is crucial, and it has to be done playfully. And from what I see of your work, you seem to have got that, and I think you're going to. My intuition is that you're going to craft a higher version from your experiences. You're going to work on that until you come with a higher practical level. But what we need then, as that happens, is for you to be able to tell us about about the pathology of some of these things, about the types of people that are coming to power, about what's wrong, what's missing, and that's the broader dimension. But that, to finish a long answer to the question, I'm very, very hopeful. Same basis, spiritual evolution, that has to be going that personal growth thing, whatever words you want to call about, it has to be there. There is a process, there is a movement, there is to someone comes to a lack of fear of death, a lack of a sense of peace with our lives, a sense of deep understanding, a sense of connection, a sense of compassion. All those things are there in the perennial philosophy. So there's nothing new under the sun in that sense.
Right. You know, when you're saying about the you know, watching the commercials and this kind of setup of we're always needing something else to feel like we're good. You know, the other day I had a client who she has an eating disorder, and she's been doing fine up until the other day. She has, in her mind, she has to weigh 130 pounds, and she got to 131. So now it's this, she's no good. She's, you know, it stops eating. She does all these things. I'm trying to, you know, short circuit that pattern. But as I was listening to her, I was kind of thinking, you know, we all seem to have that same disorder, maybe not with eating, but with a society culture that says to be a success or to be worthwhile, you have to do certain things or have certain things. And so if I have a 1,500 square foot house, it's okay, but you know, I really need a 2,000 square foot house, or a 3,000 or 5,000. Or this car is nice, but you're really a success when you have this kind of car. And we're really doing and having done to us the same thing that this poor anorexic client I have is doing to her. It's just that hers is more quickly has the possibility of taking her life, whereas ours tends to be more long term. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Exactly right. As you were saying that, take for example in Sweden, Swedish people are very into their houses, to design, the way things look. But in many senses, and I'm not going to criticize them here, get into trouble, but it's very, very superficial. It's about the appearance of something. And this is what people like the board talked about. We're living in the society of the spectacle. This is what we're living in. And the part of the empire of scientism is the hijacking of our mental apparatus so that we are programmed and programmable by mainstream media, now by the internet, with algorithms, we're utilizing behavior, knowledge from behavioral science, from cybernetics, that we can be played by this, and we're subject to it all the time for particular objectives, for particular manipulation. And if we go back to Bernal and his book, We're the Docile Population, this is only proving the accuracy of his statement, that they see us as, or some of them see us as docile population to be managed. And if we allow ourselves to be managed, then we are proving that their analysis is correct. Now, if you see yourself as a being who is, if you like, in the Hindu context, Brahman and Atman, that you are the representation of divine consciousness, or you're a microcosm of the macrocosm, or as above, so below, or you're the spirit, as in the gospel of the Gnos, or the Coptic gospel of Thomas, not one of the standard gospels, but Jesus says that it's amazing that the spirit has come to dwell in such a place as the body, because of it is such an incredible thing. And that idea is there in all that. Now, it's not to denigrate the body, because that's also a mistake that some spiritual traditions make. You can't do that. We have to we have to take a holistic view, and we know about the origin of the word holy and holistic and healing, and they all go together. So that's another word. So when you were talking about the idea of healing, so if we don't bring in the idea of whole, and if we don't have in the concept of that a spiritual idea, well, it can't be holy, it can't be whole in that sense. And I would argue that if you look, there was a letter by Sergeant Cox in 1871 to Frederick Myers when they were investigating spiritualism, and he says we need to describe some of these forces, and he there for the first time uses the notion of psychic forces. We could describe these forces we're finding as psychic forces, and psychology as the study of this. So the reason why he, as a barrister, was suggesting that to his friend after they had witnessed a lot of parapsychological phenomenon was they knew that the scientific community around them wouldn't accept anything with the word spirit in it. That's my view. So psychology, in many senses, was a reference back to the Greek notion, because Greek was okay, because Greek, you had a kind of empire, and you had the Elgin marbles in the British Museum, and it was all kind of classic and culture and over there, and it could rule other people if you were. So but spirit was taken out of it, because spirit is a dangerous concept. Spirit is dangerous because if you believe that you are created of the most intelligent, most creative force, well, then I'm not going to be able to compel you to do things. You're not going to sell you're the greatest force in the universe for some message that you get on an ad. You're not going to be fooled by that. Because if you believe that, if you understand that you are of that divine substance, of the greatest substance, that science can't understand, that science can't explain, that with all its great wisdom, most good scientists will say we know nothing about consciousness. We don't know anything about consciousness. So the deep, we have that. So the idea from, again, if we go back to the Upanishads or whatever, the Indian tradition, you are it, you are that.
Right.
Once a person realizes that they are of the deepest, most intelligence, substance. But then their monkey mind shouldn't be paying attention to some fool that's manipulating them elsewhere in a very manipulative and psychopathic way. I mean, I think there's a bit of, for me, and I'm not using that obviously as a term of art, but in my terms, there's a psychopathology, there's a psychopathy behind this dreadful manipulation of people. It's a dehumanizing things. And now the people and that mentality has an apparatus that it can utilize to manage us. And it has associated with this idea that William Easterly described as the technical illusion, the idea that you can solve an issue by intervening technically in it, irrespective of anything else, irrespective of whether you're dealing with a dictatorship. You just get the expert gives you a solution and it works, irrespective of anything underneath that. It's the same actually if you see in Bill Gates. So Bill Gates now wants to solve the climate issue by a technical intervention and thing, without respect to the range of complex factors that may determine the system. So this is what Bateson sussed out, that it was a much more complex system. And if you intervene in a system without understanding the full range, well, then you will create a difficulty. So there is the stream of perception of this of the problem and the solution is there. So as always, the solution is found close to where the problem has come from. So it probably will be in cybernetics that we find the solution to cybernetics, but it requires that people come with a critical mindset. A critical mindset means that you test the assumptions on which an argument is based, and you look and say, are those assumptions robust? And it's the same whether I'm not very good at mathematics, but I can see the flaws in a lot of statistical models that are presented to us, and it's corroborated when I ask my friends who are experts in statistics and who a lot of the wisdom gained in these things. I've looked to management accounting, for example, you can find it anywhere, but I mean, total quality management is prevent solutions as early as possible. It's not rocket science. The earlier you solve a problem, if you're making shoes in a factory line, if you have a problem, it's always more expensive the longer you leave it. If it's solved at the time where the consumer gets a dangerous shoe or whatever it is, and they fall over, it's going to be more expensive for you with litigation. If you say, I have a problem here, solve it. Well, that's a stitch in time saves nine. Your grandmother would have told you that. It's not rocket science, but some of these things can help us look. So that's why I hope that some of the people that are on the exploratory boundaries of some of these issues can come and contribute towards that emerging discourse, which is critical and constructive. It's constructive, but it's also critical because they go together. And if we succumb to other forces, we will be ruled by those people that believe that we're docile. And there's a certain stage you say, well, if you want to be ruled and domesticated in that sense, well, that's a choice we have made by omission or
And it's funny when you say being ruled. I mean, you could look at it like a literal rule or just mentally, where we give away our own mental, emotional, spiritual, as you say, power away, to where we end up living these inauthentic lives, to where we're not really truly being who we are, because we are much like, harkening back to my analogy, like the eating disorder client, where we have to maintain or get more, or then we feel that we're worthless or we aren't living, when even sometimes just having a more simpler lifestyle, like you mentioned, pulling back and going in your cave and writing and art and all, researching the things that you enjoy with your family, that's probably given you more, I'm assuming, given you more meaning than all those years in the classroom or in front of the judge doing your spiel, trying to, whatever case you're working. So that appeal to simplicity, I think, is kind of a rare thing these days.
Yes. As you were talking earlier on, I began to think about relations of mine, and there was a lot of old bachelors in Ireland, and if you looked at it and you analyzed it, these guys shouldn't have been happy on paper. They shouldn't have been happy, but in real life, they were the happiest guys you ever came across. And you go into the house. There's a film called The Field with Richard Harris, and it's not a great film. John Hurt, not a great film. I think the director made a few artistic choices that were bad. It was based on a play. I wrote an article about it, and I communicated with the playwright, a very interesting man, John B. Keane. And when they came to make the film, they used a field that my grandfather used to mind sheep in. It was his uncle's field, and he used to live there. So the actual field they used in the film, he had looked after sheep there. I used to go and see the man that had the house, a widow's cottage in the film, and it wouldn't have won any interior decor awards. It was very rough and ready, And I'm not saying it because I don't. It's not nice to talk about someone's house in a derogatory. I'm not saying that. It's just that they weren't interested in the IKEA catalog. They hadn't come to Ireland at that stage, and it was. So you go in there and you'd sit and drink tea. There was nothing else. You sit and drink tea and talk and look in the fire and talk, and that's what life is about. And I'm not joking. There was a bit broken off the door where the rooster could come in and walk around. The cat would be looking at him. The dog was there. There was this is true. There was a kind of like that at the door one night, and there was I opened it and there was a cow there. Look, I don't know. It was obviously she was looking for something, or there might be a goat, and that's the way it was. That was where, and the river was going by. And that guy was as happy as Larry. He was really, and the point about simplicity is very, very. I'll tell you a funny little thing about that. And again, I'm not saying anything bad about it. He never really washed his cups. Now, maybe it's something to run in the family because my wife thinks I'm not very good at that, and I'm not. We might have, but so he just never washed the cups. So your cups wouldn't be the most spotless. And again, I'm not criticizing him for that. It's probably, as George Carlin says, that's why you needed it. That helps you with your immune system. When he was swimming in New York, that's why you have an immune system where he doesn't get. So he gives the cups on it. And I was asking him about how they got on with the film when Richard Harris was down. I was a bit curious to see, how he got on. He said, "Oh, Richard Harris, he's a very nice man, very nice man." So this is off the record. You get a sense he didn't have to be talking to this old, whatever, 70, 80-year-old man, nearly 80 at the time. And he said, "Oh, he's very, very nice man. He used to talk about the stone walls, and he loved to see the old stone walls. And I invited him in for a drink, and he said, 'No, I don't. I've given up the drink.'" Now, Richard Harris lived in the Strand Hotel, or the Savoy Hotel in London. So that's where he lived. So he lived in the top class hotel. So I was visualizing him coming in to sit down, and he said, "Oh, but he said, I'll have a cup of tea." So he came in, and I was visualizing Richard Harris sitting there drinking tea out of one of the cups. And I said, and did he drink his tea? Oh, he did. So what that showed to me was that Richard Harris was a class individual that treated the individual that he found in different circumstances than the Savoy Hotel as an individual. That he accepted them although he's a multimillionaire, owns loads of property in Hollywood, a very, very wealthy man. He was dealing with him as an individual. It didn't matter whether he was a king or a pauper. He was in there respectfully, as he should be. Didn't matter talking to him. Now he may have been seeking inspiration for his character in the film, but that's not the point. He treated him, anytime he saw him, he treated him with respect, and that was off the record. He wasn't doing that to impress anybody else, and that impresses me. It's the same empathy, which is a real thing. It doesn't disappear. It's not switched on. It's not read off a thing. It's presumably what every genuine healer or genuine therapist who's not doing things by rote needs to be able to identify with the person before them, not looking at the appearance. Now, that man and those people were probably much happier. Well, he was much happier. He was much mentally healthy in a mental sense than most people. So we think we have everything. We're told we have everything. We're told we have all these material things. We're told we never had it so good. And really, people are disintegrating. And if they don't have a strong conception of themselves, a strong conception that they are important, that they are important in the universe, that of divine consciousness or of spiritual consciousness, or of psychic material, if you want, of which all the great minds are made of. And if we don't reduce everything to the idea of mind as if it's a mechanism of computation, right, that's in an inferior machine that needs to be altered and needs to be managed, well, that's a good start. So people, that is the key point for me, realizing that you are of that thing, and that's where the concepts of human dignity come from, and the concepts of, for example, human rights, they've been deconstructed. It's very, very dangerous concept. They're being taken away, and that's assisted by ideas. Well, what is humanity? Taking away the idea of individual rights and say we have group rights. This was a process that came from the Soviet Union. They couldn't come to the international table and say, well, we protect individual rights. So they came up with group rights. Now this is what we're getting instead of individual rights, which is very, very dangerous. That idea grew up over a long period of time, and it grew up to control power. We're losing that. And anytime we lose power, we're giving it over to tyranny. And unfortunately, that's going to happen unless we begin to utilize our spiritual consciousness in a non-violent way, of course, whereby we're using creativity, we're empowering ourselves, we're coming out of the shell, we're finding who we are, we're allowing our true genius, the thing that is in people, emerge. And everyone has that in different ways, different perspectives. Everyone has something valuable. And that's, for me, what people like Milton Erickson and all those were saying, that everyone has that capacity, and they're going behind the false self. They're going behind the self that can be controlled like a puppet. They're going behind to the superior force, the seer, the person who witnesses the thing. And the idea that you talked about authenticity, and of course that comes from the word for self, and the key word for me is sovereignty, individual sovereignty. That's where it comes. You don't get sovereignty from anybody else. It's not given to you on a birth certificate by the state. Your sovereignty is inherent, pre-existing. You have it already. Whether it's God-given for some people or not, it doesn't matter. You have that spirit, that spiritual consciousness, that dignity that's there. And you just have to realize it. Sometimes people need help. The only therapist that I've ever suggested that people go to at very occasion, as I said, because we have the pubs and now that they used to have, where people go and talk, and people used to talk to each other and talk to their neighbors, but is hypnotherapy, because I believe that hypnosis is a very, very powerful tool. Sometimes I've encountered people that have a specific problem, and I know they don't have any mental health issues, it's just that they need to change the way they see an issue. That I think hypnotherapy is a very, very useful thing to realign. And sometimes you need that outside intervention. It's not saying, okay, tell me about when what happened when you were born, all this kind of. I'm not saying there's not a role for some of that, but a lot of issues seem to be issues that a person cognitively can't escape from, and they need an intervention. They need to get out of the habit. They can't escape it, and sometimes that's where the intervention is, to extricate them from a kind of deadening, crystallized form that they can't escape from. So I do think that hypnotherapy can be very, very useful for that, and it doesn't get into it's practical, and it's goal orientated, and it doesn't make assumptions beyond the necessity of the problem.
Yeah, right. Well, I feel we've covered so much in just this short period of time. So as we kind of wrap up, if somebody came to you to said, look, I've got 1 minute. In 1 minute, what advice would you give to someone that says, okay, I've listened to this, I've seen that it's not just me, that I'm part of a more vast system that's, I don't want to say it's sick, it's just got its problems. How do I start to change myself, which hopefully changes the system? So what short advice would you give to somebody?
Well, firstly, we always have to sort out kind of egoic problems. If we're doing bad things ourselves, or we can't go lecturing the world about. So that always has to happen. We deal with problems if we're not being whatever nice to such and such. Deal with that. If we have problems, sort that out. Try and be compassionate and get above that. And through our compassion anyway, as it evolves, we begin to see other people, we begin to link with other people. And here's the key issue is that once you begin to do that, all the mystical traditions say you begin to get revelation, you begin to open up, you begin to get inspiration, the muses begin to talk to you, you begin to see things differently, you begin to access your higher levels. And that's the key thing. There's a noetic quality that doesn't, it's not constructed. So when I'm writing poetry, sometimes it appears, it's not consciously constructed. Now that comes when you begin to open yourself up, when you begin to let go, when you don't begin to control as much, when you begin to not deconstruct, but let go of certain constructions that don't work. So what I would say is that if you begin to look at the key elements, and you were talking about with one of your guests about compassion and hypnosis and idea of compassion, when you begin to access these key things in the perennial philosophy, simple ideas of compassion, empathy, and you begin to genuinely engage in them, then that enables you to see other people, and it enables you to see yourself, and it enables your higher level forces, the man or woman of light, as we see in the Sufi things, your guardian angel, if you want. It enables them to be heard. It enables the higher elements of your being to come in contact, or with the magic, if you like. It enables that to manifest itself. Nothing occult or anything. It's the inherent nature of a whole individual in a dignified sense, and that begins to emerge. It begins to flower. We're looking at a flower, a bulb before it has flowered. We can't see necessarily unless we know that there is something going to emerge from that. But that the sunflower bit is always going to come out. It's inherent in the thing. We all have that inherent potential, and we forget ourselves that we have that potential to blossom. Right. We don't believe it. We're convinced that we don't have it, and if we are convinced strongly enough and cognitively, if we're convinced, it won't happen. So you have to begin to, and that's what the issue of faith is about. And it's the same as in the placebo effect. The power of belief, when it's employed for yourself, is very powerful. The power of belief and consciousness works magic itself. So we have to get out of the way. We have to take some of those false constructs that don't work for us and move them aside so that our inherent power can begin to manifest. And the amazing thing is that you will surprise yourself, because the thing that I'm not saying you personally, anyone, the force when it comes out will reveal something that you didn't know was in you, and that's the most amazing thing. And I can demonstrate that in things that I've written. I say, well, where did that come from? And test it as well. So getting out of the way of your bigger consciousness is a critical thing. That's probably a long answer to a short.
That's great. That's great. Well, James, this has been just an absolute delight. I can't tell you how much I have enjoyed this. I feel like I know you'll hate this, but I feel like I'm sitting at the feet of the master. So,
I would have bought you an extra drink for that at this stage. We're in the pub. But Paul, I'll just say, as I said, I do think that your work is very, very interesting. And looking at your work, I found after I heard your talks, of course, on New Thinking Aloud, and I began to look at your work, and I found later, after I did so many talks and we were communicating, that actually some of the things I was saying, you were saying them from your own perspective. Yeah. So it was very, very interesting in relation. So that was interesting. So I can see that you're with your PhD and you're professional and you're working within the system, but you're also exploring, and that exploring thing is very, very interesting, because we need the bits. For me, it was the left brain, right brain thing, the lawyer academic, and I went into academia as opposed to practice, although I practiced in an international context. But you're working on one side of the brain, then you say, hold on a second, we need both. And so we need the discipline. I'm not easily convinced about things. You have to have that some disciplinary base to make these things work. And then when you begin to open up the other side of the mind and begin to get them to work together, that's where the magic comes from. So I see a similar
Right.
dimension in relation to your evolution. And I think that I have a sense that because you're prodding away and you're doing all the right things and you're talking in a very sensible way and you're very, obviously your feet are on the ground, very pragmatic, but you're willing and open to evolve these things. I think that has all the ingredients for being able to take, because when I was reading about Milton Erickson, I began to say, it's like quantum physics. The people that say they understand initially
Right.
probably don't,
Right.
So, and then I saw that you had actually addressed that issue, which is quite amazing,
Yeah.
because it needs the mediator. Because I can understand. I say, oh yeah, I understand that. Well, no, I don't actually understand. I don't actually understand it. It's very, very difficult. It's deceptive in that sense. So I will be very interested to see where you're going with that, and I hope also that you can begin to, as a public intellectual, begin to also, in that role, feed some of your insights into the broader issues, because we have to have some, what I call a mystical murmuration of cooperation, of loose affiliation of people in different domains with different insights, drawn on those experiences you have from the various streams of psychotherapy and psychology and psychiatry, to inform it. So I hope you will contribute in that domain as well in the future.
I appreciate it. Thank you, my friend.